Welcome to PoliticIt Talk, where we talk about political strategy. I'm Josh Light.
And I'm Sterling Morris.
Today's podcast covers targeting supporters. Sterling, can you refresh our memory on exactly what a supporter is?
Yeah, last week we basically broke down or segmented a political candidate's field of voters into three different categories. And those are voters who support your candidate, voters who support another candidate, and voters who are undecided. So supporters are simply those voters who are likely to support your candidate.
And last week we talked about the mathematics that it takes to actually win and how much support a candidate needs from each of these three groups of voter types.
So once you as a campaign manager or a politician or a political candidate understand how many voters are in those three categories and basically or roughly what percentage of each category is needed to win, the process of finding and targeting specific voters can begin. And of course, identifying who these specific voters are allows a campaign to later share campaign material with them in hopes that the voter will support the campaign's candidate.
The ability to segment the population into groups of voters who support your candidate is essential to a campaign success. Every campaign, large or small, has limited funds, so correctly identifying supporters comes down to efficiency, ensuring campaigns are using every available dollar in a sophisticated way.
Yeah, and the most common way to identify supporters is, and the most common way in the past has been through phone calls where volunteers or the candidate himself calls up registered voters and asks who they plan to vote for. And this is called ID calls. You're essentially identifying who your supporters are and specifically who they are, so you have their names and addresses so you can later send them material. So once the supporter's identified, she or he is added into this segmented list, and it's defined by characteristic parameters like how old the person is, what sex the person is, where the person lives, so you can later use that information. But unfortunately, there are just a few problems with that. Most of the registered voters on average voter lists don't have numbers listed. And if they do, then you run into the problem of them not answering their phone and other voters not being willing to share their political information over the phone. They might not know who you are and might not trust you. So those are some of the problems, but there are other ways to identify who your supporters are.
That's right, Sterling. And it's very, very challenging to develop a solid list of supporters through the telephone. But there's other ways that you can do. There's other mathematical ways and analytical tools that you can use to do this. But if you can remember anything from today's PoliticIt talk, it's this: that party affiliation is one of the most powerful indicators on whether or not you have that voter's success than any other variable.
Yeah, some of the data we've looked at here at PoliticIt kind of backs up that notion that Josh emphasized. One recent national election exit poll showed that about 20% of voters consider themselves liberal, 33% conservative, and 47% moderate. And those are almost the identical numbers that we saw way back in 1976. So the makeup of America's voters is essentially the same. It hasn't really changed over the last 30 to 40 years.
With that said, Sterling, there has been a bit of a change from the 70s until today. Americans have become far more partisan, making a voter's party affiliation even more telling. For example, I remember in 76, Democratic presidential candidate Jimmy Carter, he saw 29% of the conservative vote. Democratic presidential candidate John Kerry only saw 15% of the conservative vote.
Yeah, so we're definitely becoming more partisan, and given that the phone calling system doesn't always work exactly how we would like it to, one of the best methods of determining who your supporters are, aside from the phone call, is by figuring out what their party affiliation is. And we can see that they have, if you are running as a Democratic candidate and they are registered as a Democratic voter, there is a high probability that they will vote for you, even if they don't know much about you or your campaign. with that said, a lot of voter lists don't list the registered party voters are registered to. But there are a number of good ways to figure out if that voter is a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent. And based on some political knowledge that is kind of out there, there are basically 6 demographical characteristics that you can break a voter down by and have a good idea if she or he is a Democrat or Republican.
That's right, Sterling. And one of the first traits that you can look at to figure out whether a voter is a Republican or a Democrat is their ethnicity. Typically, African Americans will vote Democrat 90% of the time. And so there's lots of tools out there for politicians to use to identify African American voters. One of the tools that exists is e-tech, and it basically can go through a list and look at the names and figure out whether or not you're African American. But there's other methods too. You can look in social networks for popular clubs, restaurants, music groups, and other organizations that African Americans might patronize, and then you could follow the people that are actually in those groups and social networks. But there's no guarantee that these individuals in the social networks are actually voters themselves.
The same goes with Hispanic Americans. They also tend to be Democratic in their political views, but not quite as much as the average African American. For example, some of the research we found showed that 54% of Hispanic Americans voted for John Kerry in 2004, and then Al Gore got 62% in 2000. So it looks like there might have been a bit of a trend toward bipartisanship, and George Bush certainly brought the numbers down. I remember he did a 5-minute commercial where he spoke completely in Spanish, which the Hispanic American populace really seemed to like. We're still waiting on the numbers for the 2012 election. And among this group, the younger Hispanic population seems to be a little bit more liberal than the older population who was born outside the U.S. and immigrated to the U.S.
Sterling, another variable is church attendance. People that attend church weekly, out of those people that attend church weekly, 60% of themselves identified themselves as Republicans, whereas only 35% identified themselves as Democrats. So if you're a Republican candidate out there, a good way to find supporters would be to go to churches and actually spread your message there.
2 other characteristics that are really important to consider when you're trying to identify your supporters are marital status and gender. Marital status is actually a very strong characteristic based on historical voting data. Those who are married are much more likely to vote conservatively than those who are unmarried. The same can be said about women and men, but to a lesser extent. Women are typically more liberal in their voting patterns, whereas men are traditionally more conservative. So given that, a married man would, of course, be the most conservative, and a unmarried woman would be the most liberal.
Sterling, another really interesting variable you can look at out there is where you live. People who live in the cities tend to be a lot more liberal, whereas those who live in the suburbs tend to vote a little more conservative. So if you could put this into practical meaning for those politicians out there, if you're going out and you're a Democrat, you probably want to focus your efforts if you're going after Democratic supporters in urban areas and cities. First, because that's kind of low-hanging fruit for you if you were just looking at that variable alone.
The final variable that's important and helpful is gun ownership. And most people know that gun owners tend to be Republican. They tend to vote Republican, and unarmed voters tend to be Democratic. So given that stat, one way you could target them is finding gun-related social media outlets. I found one called Gun Ownership. It's a Twitter handle, and its description is basically an organization where people can learn how to qualify to carry their guns in Arizona. So if I was a politician in Arizona, one technique I could use to targeting likely supporters, given that I'm a Republican, would be to follow those who follow this Twitter handle.
Yeah, and if you follow them, you'll probably get a 10 to 15% follow back, maybe even higher than that, just by following them. But if for gun ownership too, you can also go out and you can get a list, if possible, from the state of individuals who have hunting license. Because if you have a hunting license, you're probably a gun owner. So that's another way a conservative politician could go out to find some Republican voters.
I think that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Next week we're going to be talking about finding persuadable voters.
PoliticIt Talk is brought to you by PoliticIt. PoliticIt provides powerful real-time campaign analytics for politicians. Contact PoliticIt if you would like to be a beta tester.